We are here to talk about difficult questions relating to Operation Protective Edge. Lots to talk about. This is over 20 days now that Operation Protective Edge, since Operation Protective Edge has been launched with about 1,000 plus Palestinian civilians and or militants that have been killed, many more injured. In Israel, the casualty rate is 43, most of them soldiers. And what we see in the international media are mostly cries to end the conflict, to stop this cycle of violence, to stop the tit for tat. And some of the accusations that we'll talk about today are the use of disproportionate force. Israel is accused of using disproportionate force in the Gaza Strip. Look at the high death toll. And also that we're targeting civilians in Gaza intentionally. And so in this short webinar, I'd like to address some of these accusations and provide you with a method of how to answer them, how to answer these accusations, whether on social media, whether in one-on-one conversations. But again, if you look at the main claims against Israel today, during this operation, during the Gaza war, is why is Israel targeting civilians? Look how many of them have been killed over this, over the course of 3 weeks. And why is Israel using too much force? Again, if you look at the death toll, we're talking about over 1,000 Palestinians versus only 40 plus Israelis that have been killed. So let's start by learning a method which will then serve us in answering some of these tough questions. The method I'd like to teach you is called ARM. Now, here we go. Let me try to do, okay. ARM is a technique that stands for address, reframe, and message. Okay? Now, when someone comes up with an accusation, rather than ignoring it, rather than disregarding the accusation, it is helpful to address it. If the accusation is true, you can say, this is true and it's very unfortunate that civilians are dying in Gaza. If the accusation is false, you shouldn't be afraid to say, no, this is false, this is simply untrue. But you have to find a way to address it, and we'll look at examples in a second, and then we'll make it relevant to the Gaza operation. Reframe stands for going on the offensive. Oftentimes when people bring up accusations against Israel, we find ourselves on the defensive. Israel's not an apartheid state. Israel's not targeting civilians. It's not using disproportionate force. And then people will bring up another one. What about the checkpoints? And what about the security barrier? And as long as we're on the defensive, it's ineffective. At some point, you have to put your foot down and go on the offensive and control the agenda of the debate. Okay? So we're going to learn how to do that. And finally, M stands for message. We want to end off with a strong message. We want to enforce a key message at the end of the conversation. Now, I'm going to give you a very simple example from a domestic situation, okay? And this is actually how ARM was started. by a person called Charles Jacobs about a decade ago, who is also a strong advocate for Israel. He came up with the following message. He said to his daughter one day, "Jessica, you're not practicing your violin. Jessica, you're not practicing your violin." And Jessica actually responded using arm. She said, "I know I should." She addressed it. She reframed, right? She zoomed out and said, "You need to understand why I can't do it. You're asking too much of me. I'm only 12 years old. You're too demanding. You must stop imposing your values on me." And her message was, "I have to be my own person." Okay? Simple situation in a family dispute. Let's see now how we can apply it to some of the accusations that we hear today. Okay? Whether it's Israel's using disproportionate force, or whether it is Israel targeting civilians in the Gaza Strip. And before I give you methods of addressing this, I'll just say the following. When people say Israel is using disproportionate force, where does that come from really? Well, it comes from, look at the numbers, as I said. Look at how many Palestinians versus Israelis. It's very simple. And it's important to outline to people, to highlight to people, that this is not a numbers game. It's not about numbers. It's not about Israel. In Israel, there are only 40 killed, and in the Gaza Strip, over 1,000. Why is it not about numbers? Because if you think about it, the fact that Israel sanctifies, values life, and has shelters, and has sirens. We just had 3 sirens here in Israel warning us that Hamas is shooting rockets at us, right? So, in order, think about the question of whether Israel has to not have shelters, whether Israel has to not have red siren alerts, in order for the conflict to be proportionate. This is a ridiculous analogy. How do you measure proportionality not based on numbers? You measure proportionality based on, and this is the definition in international law, the amount of force that is necessary to deal with a threat. Proportionality is about the amount of force that is necessary to deal with a threat. It's not about how many people are killed. Every death is tragic. It's about the amount of force that is necessary. So an example that Mayor Bloomberg once gave was, let's say that I'm in my apartment in Yerushalayim, and I hear a knock on the door, and I see through the peephole that someone is carrying a big gun, a big rifle, AK-47, and he's threatening to kill me. And I call the police. Would I expect the police to send in, quote unquote, proportionate force, one policeman to help me with the situation, to help me deal with a threat? Or would I expect the police to send the necessary amount of force to deal with the threat? That is what proportionate force is. It is not a numbers game. It is not a casualty game. Another thing that is important to mention here is the combatant civilian casualty ratio. Now again, if you want to understand, if you want to assess Israel's conduct in a war with guerrilla forces, it is important not to do so in a vacuum. You have to compare it to something. What do you compare it to? You don't want to compare it to, say, Syria, where over 100,000 people have been killed, most of them civilian. But let's say comparing Israel to the conduct of the American army in Afghanistan, or NATO forces in Bosnia. The average rate for these kinds of battles is 1 to 4. That is, for every one militant, combatant that is killed, 4 civilians have been killed in the conflict. 1 to 4. 1 combatant, 4 civilians. That is, quote unquote, legit. Is it okay? Is it not tragic that civilians are killed? Of course it is, but that is what is legitimate in international norms. In Israel, and we don't have statistics yet for this war, but according to some sources, it's 1 to 2. In other words, 1 civilian per 1 combatant, per 2 civilians. 1 to 2, and that is a conservative estimate. In the previous operation, Kastled, it was 1 to 1. Again, every death is tragic, but in order to measure proportionality, you have to compare it to something. So again, it's not a numbers game, and you have to compare Israel's conduct to the conduct of other armies dealing with terrorist activities. So how do you use arm to respond to Israel's using disproportionate force? Well, you first of all address the accusation. And you address it by just stating that Israel, like all other states, has the right, the duty, and obligation to protect its citizens as guaranteed by Article 51 of the UN Charter. According to international norms, Israel is permitted to use necessary and appropriate force to defeat the threat and is not obligated to adjust its capabilities to those of Hamas. In other words, if Hamas targets civilians and then hides behind them in the Gaza Strip, Israel is not required to do that. That is ridiculous, right? Israel has the right to protect its civilians, and it actually goes to great lengths to do so, and at the same time to protect civilians in the Gaza Strip by sending warning signals, leaflets about future attacks. The reframe part is, if you're interested in disproportionate use of force, Israel's legitimate use of force against military targets, Hamas targets, Islamic Jihad targets, stands in stark contrast to Hamas's deliberate targeting of civilian areas and use of civilians as human shields. Just recently, Hamas targeted a school bus with an anti-tank missile. These actions are unethical, immoral, and constitute a violation of international law. The message is that no country can tolerate the indiscriminate targeting of its civilians. Israel's use of force is a legitimate act of self-defense to protect its citizens. That's an example of using arm to respond to Israel, the claim that Israel uses disproportionate force. Let me see if I can. Okay. All right. Now, what about you're targeting civilians intentionally? Look at how many men, women, and children in Gaza have been killed. Okay, similar kind of accusations. Okay, let me show you the first one, the first video. I'd like to show you one video that actually shows how not to respond, unfortunately. And we've had examples like this, how not to respond to accusations by the international media. Zvi, could you please play the first video of Naftali Bennett?
By Israel's Minister for the Economy, Naftali Bennett. Very good to talk to you, Mr. Bennett. Everyone understands the rights of nations to protect their integrity and to protect their citizens, but by any stretch of the imagination, is Israel's response not disproportionate here?
Are you kidding me? If 1,000 missiles were shot on your home and on your family, like they were this morning, would you be talking about the proportional? The only difference between us and Hamas in Gaza, that we see right now an attack over here, the only difference between us and Hamas in Gaza is that they are deliberately sending their women and children to stand next to missile launchers in order for them to get killed, and then they can cry to the world that they're being killed. This is cynical and cowardly. Your question is not appropriate because Israel has all the right to defend itself. We pulled out of Gaza Strip 9 years ago, back to the 67 lines. There's no Jews in Gaza. They started this, they're continuing this. This can all go away the moment they disarm themselves and
right,
stop
you've had
shooting
your say,
us.
right, but I am not kidding you, but the fact is that, yes, and as you heard me say in my first question there, of course everyone understands the right of Israel to protect itself. But the disproportionate part of it you didn't effectively answer. You say that all the civilians that are killed in Gaza are being used as human shields. Do you really believe that?
I know that overwhelming majority. You know, on Thursday morning, the UN officially discovered 20 missiles within a school. Hamas is placing missiles in homes, in living rooms, in schools, in children's rooms. This is their modus operandi. That's their method. Now I'm asking you and asking every viewer that's watching right now, if Hamas was shooting missiles at your home from within a school, what would you do? Would you just wait for those missiles to kill you? We fight back. We fight back in order to defend ourselves.
You know, this question has been put to many in the UK, and they reply, we wouldn't indiscriminately kill women and children. We've got pictures, let's just have a look at them now, of
we are
the
not,
aftermath of
Okay. We saw here one example. One example. Again, I don't want to say that it was completely ineffective. In many ways it was. I believe that what was missing here is, first of all, some calm. Again, you can be passionate, and it is important to be passionate, and sometimes even frustrated by some of the absurd accusations that are made by the international media, by some of the bias that you can see in stations like CNN or like Sky News. You want to make sure that you remain calm. And one thing that helps you to do that is to know what you're going to say in advance. When you see people like Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett in other cases, when you see him defend Israel, they know their facts. They know what they're going to say. They've rehearsed it over and over and over again. You want to address it. You want to address the allegation. Naftali Bennett did not address this allegation. He just said, "Are you kidding me?" That doesn't work. Now, we might agree with him, or some of us might agree with him, but the average listener will be turned off by that. You address the allegation, you zoom out, you talk about other conflicts, you talk about other armies and their conduct in similar situations. And then you end with a strong message. And I would say that the message here is Hamas needs to be held accountable for their ideology, which calls for Israel's annihilation, and mostly for their actions. Over 2,500 rockets have been launched at Israel over the last 20 days, putting more than 50% of Israeli population under constant rocket threat. We just had red siren calls, red siren alerts here in Israel. In the north of Israel, in Zichron Yaakov, for example, earlier on today, we had alerts in Ashkelon in the south. We had alerts in Yavne, in Sderot. My parents had an alert yesterday in Rishon LeZion. So, again, make sure that you stay calm and make sure that you address the allegation. Now, another example of how to respond to this allegation is Israel is deliberately targeting civilians in Gaza. Again, you address the allegation. If the allegation is incorrect, you say. This is incorrect. Israel targets Hamas infrastructure and terrorists and goes to great lengths to avoid civilian casualties. You reframe, right? You reframe and you talk about Hamas's use of human shields. You talk about Hamas, Islamic Jihad, using hospitals, mosques to fire at Israel. They're firing at civilians in Israel and then hiding behind them in the Gaza Strip to increase the casualty rate. Israel, like every country, has the right to defend itself, and the message is Hamas needs to be held accountable for its extremist ideology. Let's see, Tzvi, let's see another example of addressing disproportionate force. This is Netanyahu in one of his better interviews on Sky News. This specific example is during the Second Lebanese War in 2006. Notice here that Netanyahu is doing a bunch of things. He's addressing the allegation. He's drawing a distinction. He's defining what proportionate force is. And then he says Israel has not been using disproportionate force. And he zooms out and draws equivalents or draws comparisons with other kinds of battles, and he targets the specific audience, the British audience that he is speaking to. So, Tzvi, can we please see the next video that I sent you?
Well, joining us here in the studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu, thank you for joining us with reaction to those latest figures, because certainly many Israelis perhaps have believed by now they would be safer, that the rocket attacks would have been contained, curtailed. Ehud Olmert said that the Hezbollah infrastructure was being dismantled. Clearly, though, they've still got a very effective military capability.
That's true, and I think that makes the objective of removing the threat, destroying their capability, eliminating their missile arsenal even more imperative. I think the fact that you have, according to your reports, five innocent people targeted, wiped out deliberately, not accidentally, but deliberately. The fact that 2 million Israelis are in bomb shelters. The fact that a bicycle rider yesterday went out to get his dog, to put him back in the shelter, got killed. We can't live like this without eliminating the threat. And you can ask a question that I would ask for all those who question Israel. What would you be saying today? What would you ask Tony Blair to do, the Prime Minister of Britain, if London was being rocketed by hundreds, indeed thousands of rockets? You'd be screaming your head off saying, get rid of that, the source of that fire. And I think in this sense, the Israeli public is behaving miraculously, courageously.
The issue of proportionality, of course, has been raised in many capitals across the world. What would you say would have been a disproportionate response then to those rocket attacks?
Well, I don't want to say a disproportionate response, because then I'd be criticizing Britain. But when London was rocketed, Churchill's response was to flatten German cities. Dresden was wiped out completely. And I do not criticize Churchill's government for doing that, because it was, in fact, a time of great urgency. The main point is that the only way that we can judge proportionality is to ask, how did other countries behave under similar circumstances? When Syria, that attacks us, criticizes us, wiped out 15,000 civilians in the Syrian town of Hama in one afternoon, I don't think they can voice an objection.
We'll assess that in a moment. We're just getting some breaking news, which we'll just update people with in terms of the Forest Gate anti-terror raid. We're now being
hear me. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. I hope that made it a bit more clear how to use this method. And again, I want to emphasize here that there is not just one way of using ARM, and that ARM is not the only method to use. You see speakers, you see effective spokespeople using different methods, but what's common to all of them is that they know their materials. They know their materials, they know the facts, they contextualize, they make distinctions. In other words, they don't just give stories, which is important because you want to find a way to appeal to emotions, and that's exactly what Netanyahu did. Right? So if I explain the situation in Gaza, I can tell a story of a family friend that has been affected by the rockets in Ashkelon. So you want to be able to appeal to emotions, but you also want to make sure that you give people statistics and facts, and that you contextualize, you compare to other conflicts. Now, immediately when you do that, when you compare Israel's conduct to, say, Britain or Syria, then people will usually come back with, well, we're not talking about Syria, and why are you diverting attention to another conflict? I'm not talking about Britain in the 40s. Two wrongs don't make a right, we often hear. And there's some value to that. But I would argue that if you want to assess Israel's conduct, you have to compare it to something. And I often ask people who say to me, the IDF is immoral and unethical. And I'll ask them, and some of my students have heard this from me. I'll ask them, compared to whom is the Israeli Defense Force immoral and inhumane? And they'll say again, two wrongs don't make a right, don't divert the attention. And I'll say, no, stay with me. Compared to whom? Compared to Syria, who in 1982 killed over 20,000 in the town of Hama, or Syria today, in which over 150,000 have been killed? Compared to that, is the Israeli army immoral and inhumane? Maybe not. Compared to the French, who in the 60s killed over 100,000 Algerians that rose against colonialism, French colonialism. Compared to the Russians in Chechnya, is the Israeli army immoral and inhumane? Compared to whom is the Israeli army immoral and inhumane? Compared to the Jordanians, who in 1970 killed over 10,000 Palestinians who dared to rise against the regime. Compared to whom? Compared to NATO forces in Bosnia? I don't think so. According to many experts on international law, Israel's moral conduct is amongst the best in the world. And again, every death is tragic. We're not saying it's not. But if you assess a country, you need to compare it to something. And so again, compared to whom is the Israeli army immoral and inhumane? Compared to a utopian standard of perfection? Yes, indeed. The Israeli army is immoral and inhumane compared to that standard, but so is every army, every individual, every organization, every government in the world. And to put Israel on this pedestal and to expect it to abide by impossible utopian standards, that is unfair, that is unjust and hypocritical. And I will go even further and say that de facto, perhaps not by intent, but de facto, when you are singling out the Jewish state, it is also anti-Semitic. So I hope these tools will help you the next time that you see a post on Facebook, Israel is targeting civilians, Israel is using disproportionate force. Remember the following things. Remember to contextualize, to zoom out. Remember that it's not a numbers game. It's not about how many people were killed on both sides, each death being tragic. It's about proportionate force, is the amount of force necessary to deal with a given threat. And Israel is doing that. Remember the ratio of combatants versus civilians that are killed. In Israel, it's amongst the lowest in the world for this kind of conduct. These are all things to bring across when you talk about Israel's right to defend itself, when you answer tough allegations about the current conflict in Gaza and future conflicts. Let's hope that we don't get to those situations. So you want to make sure that you zoom out, contextualize, address the allegations. Let me take a few questions before I wrap up today. Anybody have a question? I can see it in the chat below. Yes. Okay, so Carol says that people in the US think that Israeli PR is terrible. That may be the case, but once again, I would urge you to zoom out and to look at the history of Israeli PR and to compare Israel's PR in this specific operation in this time to Israel's PR in the war, in the Second Lebanese War, or before that. We've had to learn the hard way. Still, we can definitely get better. I think a key element to remember is that you don't want to find yourself apologizing, going too much on the defensive. Okay, we have nothing to apologize for. We have the right to defend ourselves. Zev, can you explain the reason for the original blockade? Media like asking what else Gaza can do when it is in the largest open-air prison. That is a good question, and I'm not sure I can fully answer that. Because there are some in Israel that say, well, you left the Gaza Strip. We disengaged from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Why are we still blockading their land crossings? Why is there still a naval and air blockade? And again, there are some in Israel that say, yes, you disengage unilaterally and you need to stay out and stop this blockade on the Gaza Strip. So I don't have I think a satisfactory answer or a complete answer. I'll just say this. Hamas right now is the ruler of Gaza. Hamas is a terrorist organization committed to Israel's destruction. Without the land blockade, without the air blockade, the naval blockade, multiple more rockets, missiles, explosives would enter the Gaza Strip. And so Israel has that right to defend itself. It would just be like if Mexico were a terrorist state threatening Israel, and there would be ships channeled from Iran to Mexico with explosives and missiles. Would America not do the same? Would it not conduct a naval blockade, an air blockade on an enemy state right next to it? So these are some of the questions that I would ask you, but again, you should know that not everyone feels that the blockade on Gaza is justified. Another question. So Leo just asked, Marshall just told CBS that he believes in coexistence between Hamas and Jews and Christians. When he's openly lying and uninformed, people agree, what do you do? That's a very interesting statement that Khalid Mashal, for anyone who doesn't know, the head political chair of Hamas, told CBS that he's willing to coexist with Israel, that he's willing to accept Israel. That is not a serious response. That is not a serious statement. Israel can stop the blockade on Gaza. Israel can also start negotiating with Hamas. But things have to change on the ground. Hamas needs to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Unfortunately, it has not done so. If you want some homework for today, read the Hamas charter. See what it says about Israel. See the fanatic language that it uses against Jews. That has to change on the ground. Children in Gaza, children in the West Bank need to learn to accept the fact that there is a Jewish state here and that we're here to stay. Until that changes, every statement that you might hear in Canadian, American, British media means nothing if it is not accompanied by the same statement in Arabic on Al Jazeera, on Al Arabiya, and other Arab networks. Why doesn't Egypt set up a camp for the civilians trying to flee? That's a good question. Why doesn't Egypt help the Palestinians in Gaza? Why doesn't it set up a camp? Because there is a double standard. And because you should know that Egypt is not interested now in another 1.5 million refugees from the Gaza Strip. It is not interested in Hamas terrorists in its midst. Already you have in the Sinai, Al-Qaeda and other radical Islamic terrorist groups that are in that area that are threatening the stability of the Egyptian military regime. And so there is no way that Egypt will allow additional Palestinians to enter that area. Again, there is also no way to monitor. Are you allowing in a militant or are you allowing in a civilian? It doesn't work that way. Egypt, just like Israel, has the interest to keep this conflict, to end this conflict, and also to eliminate the threat of Hamas, because there's a threat not just to Israel. It is a threat not just to Israel, but also to Egypt. One last question before we go. Zev, what's the plan? This is Arya. What's the plan after we conclude the operation? Should we stay in Gaza in order to prevent this war to come back? Or does Israel believe that destroying Hamas, they won't come back? So what's the plan when we conclude this operation? What is Israel planning? Israel will probably not stay in the Gaza Strip. There are already talks about a ceasefire, especially after Obama's demand last night that Israel and Hamas cease fire. There are voices in the Israeli government, there are voices on the right, but not only on the right in Israel, that call to reclaim the Gaza Strip and to get rid or to topple the Hamas regime, and then to allow for another more moderate regime like the Palestinian Authority. There are many in the Israeli government, there are many in Israel that claim that this is the way to go. Will this happen in this current conflict? I don't think so. Unfortunately, the best we can hope for now, is a ceasefire, is the destruction of as many tunnels as possible, because Hamas has been using and has intended to use many more of these tunnels to infiltrate into villages and kibbutzim and moshavim right next to the Gaza Strip. At this point, the intention of this operation is to eliminate as many rockets, as many missiles as possible that Hamas has, to eliminate the infrastructure that allows for the launching of these rockets, and to destroy as many tunnels as possible in order to protect civilians in the Gaza area and beyond. Okay, people, thank you very much for participating in this webinar. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties we had at the start of the webinar. We've also had a bunch of red sirens throughout this webinar, but thank you for staying in it, and we hope to see you soon in the next webinar. Hopefully it will be more quiet and calm in this neck of the woods. Good night.